Amy Meraki, thank you very much for coming on the show.
You're welcome.
I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. You and I have known each other for... What was that? Do you have ghosts?
Heather's in the kitchen, I think, making dinner, so she'll be
Okay.
getting up soon.
Shut up, Heather. Jesus. Oh, you're wearing headphones. Okay, she can't hear me yelling at her. Okay.
No, she can't.
All right, I'll yell at her some other time. Okay. Awesome. During some of our fuck you exercises, I'll yell at her.
Yeah, which I think, it was where we first really started getting to know each other, was screaming fuck you at each other.
Oh my God, it was too.
Yeah, that was 2 years ago.
Yeah, we were paired up.
Yeah.
We went nuts.
Oh, yeah.
That was really cool. I actually, it's funny how going through an exercise like that can actually make you feel really connected to someone. It's like, hey, we went through some shit together.
Yeah, that was intense.
That was intense.
We're bonded.
Bonded for life. I don't know. Maybe that's my bonded thing. I don't know. But yeah. Bonded. Okay. Anyways, so I always like to give my guests an opportunity to brag about themselves and basically describe what it is that they do. So why don't you take a minute or two and just tell us who you are and what makes you special?
Oh, thanks, Ryan.
We've only got 2 minutes, so I know this. I think this could go for like a couple hours. Or all the things that make you special, but
I'm a coach and a creative, primarily a creative that kind of fell into coaching through my own self-healing journey. So a couple of years ago, I started a blog, and I was going through a bit of a crisis in my own life. Really got into self-discovery. I was going through hard breakup, kind of started looking inward when one does when they're faced with challenging times in life. And I started to create to really get to know who I was, and started asking myself, like, what am I here to do? Who am I? How do I want to give back? Who do I want to be in the world? What makes me happy? What makes me feel free? What makes me feel fully self-expressed? That was like the real root for me. It was like, how do I be me in the world? And as I started to explore that idea of full self-expression, I started coming up against my blocks to full self-expression, which were around the way that I looked. It was around my sexuality. It was around my creativity. And I started to dive deeper into these areas of exploration to heal these blocks, and stumbled upon Tantra, and started finding teachers who I really respected and admired, and started training under them. And this past year, I've gone through a vigorous and intensive 600-hour love, sex, and relationship coaching certification to help me serve others. And so I've been working with women primarily in helping them find their empowerment and connect back to their authenticity and their bodies and their freedom to be themselves in the world.
That's amazing.
And in their relationships. It's a long-winded answer. Women's empowerment coach.
We went for about 2 minutes, 5 seconds. So wrap it up.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome. And that is a really intensive training that you did, because I know a couple people that did it, obviously including yourself. And there is a lot in it.
Yeah.
A lot. And the women's empowerment thing and I think is really important, especially with some of your background and what it is that you did in the past, and also in your story, you mentioned the slut shaming thing, especially like we're getting that at such a young age, and I think that's a story that a lot of women can really relate to. A lot of the women that I talk to say, yeah, it started when I was really young. I'd start getting slut shamed. I mean, Veronica, who I co-founded the Intimate Lifestyle with all those years ago, she said the same thing. She had sex with her boyfriend, and then people started calling her a slut, and she's like, what the but I love him. What is going on? So what's the story there for you? I mean, what happened? At what point did you start getting that? And was it just you that was receiving that? Like, what was it? What was it like for you?
Yeah. I was around 13 when it started, actually, and I was just blossoming into puberty and really sort of coming into beauty and exploring with makeup and watching a lot of movies. And when we're young, we're so susceptible to the conditioning and the advertisements and everything going on around us that says like we have to look a certain way to be loved. And I started to explore around that age, and I also started getting a lot of attention from the boys at school, and it was something that I wasn't used to. Before that, I kind of considered myself a pretty geeky introvert that was a really good student and sat in the front row and just wanted to get good grades. So it was interesting for me to have that attention at such a young age. And I remember going to a party, and there was another girl there who had a crush on a guy. And this guy actually had a crush on me, and I didn't want anything to do with him, but
he wasn't geeky enough for you?
I just was like, I'm 13. Like, what do I do with this? And I think, some drinking may have been involved. So at this party, this girl started picking on me. There's this guy there that was really wanting my attention, and she started calling me a slut at the party and was like, "You're a slut." Yeah, it was really, really intense for me. And I remember going to
What are
school.
you, 12?
She was a year older than me,
actually,
so
yeah.
It's really intimidating, The grade 8ers.
I know. That's when they get vicious.
So yeah, I remember going to school on Monday morning, and she had started a bunch of rumors about me, that I had sex with a bunch of guys, and that I was a slut, and like just these awful, awful things. And from that point onward, they kind of ganged up, and I felt really ostracized from belonging at school. I felt really unsafe. I lived in a really small town. There was like 10,000 people there, and I would find graffiti at like the bus stop saying Amy is a slut. And this was before social media was a thing, but we had MSN Messenger, and I started getting death threats from these girls at school.
Are you serious?
So yeah, it was so intense. Yeah.
Death threats?
Yeah, at 13 years old. And like, I was pretty confused about like what had happened. I was like, I didn't actually even do anything with this guy.
I don't even like this guy.
I didn't fucking like this guy.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is so crazy. Out of curiosity, like well, I mean, obviously that's why I'm asking a question, because I'm curious. Did you receive did you receive the most amount of bullying?
At school.
Sorry, no, I guess from the guys or from the girls?
From the girls.
From the girls? Yeah. I've actually heard that the guys get the majority of the bullying is from the other guys, and then the girls get the majority of bullying from other girls. That's kind of what I've heard.
Yeah, but it was interesting though, because at that age, the girls were the ones bullying me, but it kind of shifted the way that the guys started treating me, because it may have given them some permission to objectify me in some way and think that I was then easy, or to treat me like a slut, or whatever could have been going on for them at that age. And how I felt at that age, receiving that treatment from other people around me, is I started learning a couple different things. I started learning that it was shameful or unsafe to be sexual or to look a certain way. And I started to believe that maybe they're right. Maybe I am dirty, or I am garbage, or do have something to be shameful about. And at that age, it then spun me into a lot of depression and anxiety and self-abuse. And I got into drugs and drinking and partying as a way to numb out the pain that I was facing from this trauma of being ostracized.
Yeah, that's often what people end up doing, turning to alcohol and partying.
Yeah.
So then how did you deal with your sexuality? Like, what did you, since you started feeling like, hey, maybe you are dirty, maybe you are, well, yeah, like you just said, like dirty. What did you do with your sexuality then? Did you find that you repressed it? Did you become indiscriminate? What did you do with it?
Yeah, I found throughout my teenage years, I then did make poor choices. I started to buy into the belief that they were true, and I started to not see my worth, and I started to give my body away to people for love and approval. And I wasn't self-respecting after that. I took on their belief of me that there was something wrong or shameful or gross, and that was all I was worth. And that carried on for a couple of years when I was really young until I had like another moment of a crisis in my life. My dad actually passed away when I was 16, and I realized that like the behavior that I was doing wasn't who I truly was or who I truly want to be. It was an awakening of sorts, where I felt like I wanted to change. I wanted to change how I was behaving. I wanted to change how I treated myself. And I kind of took a step back and really turned to art and really turned to myself and journaling and expression, and shut down my sexuality in a lot of ways after that. And in my relationships, in my late teens and early 20s, I felt really numb and disconnected, and like there was always something wrong with me. I had a really hard time feeling pleasure with partners. I had a really hard time feeling safe and comfortable in my body, and I always felt like afterwards I would feel used, like, which wasn't true. It just felt like that based off of my past experiences.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was curious about what that sexual shame, because with all those comments, obviously you're going to start feeling a lot of sexual shame. Mm-hmm. So I was curious about how that was going to impact your relationships in the future, both to yourself and to your partners. And you basically just said it, that you had a hard time experiencing pleasure, and then you started to feel used. What do you mean that you used to feel used, and how do you feel now?
Well, I used to feel used in the sense that because my brain had paired together like men only want me for my body, or I am just a slut, or whatever had happened in my early sexual experiences that had wired in my brain like sexual pleasure with being an object. When I decided to stop that behavior and then later on entered into relationships, that programming was still in my mind. So even if my partner wasn't necessarily using me, I would find evidence or create a story or even have like a visceral reaction in my body that felt like I was being used for sex and projecting that onto them. Does that make sense?
So how did that result your relationships then? I mean, if you had that feeling towards sexuality, did you find yourself choosing a partner that would use you in that way? Or did you find that you sort of the pull? Sorry, go ahead.
I actually avoided a lot of intimate relationships during that phase. So there was one relationship that I had for about 3 years, which I felt really shut down in, and would avoid sex in the relationship because I would feel used. And even though he wasn't using me, I withheld sex from him, thinking that's all he wanted.
Yeah, and did you find that you would go and get sex elsewhere?
No.
No? Okay.
No.
Wow.
Yeah. And so
that's interesting. Even though you were in a relationship and for 3 years, you still had that programming that he only wanted you for sex, or that if he wanted to have sex, that he just wanted you for sex.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. That sexual shame is deep shit, hey?
So deep. Yeah.
So how did that, I guess, I mean, obviously, I'm assuming you're not still dating the person anymore. I mean, based on my knowledge of you, you're not still dating the person.
Yeah, that was about 7 years ago that experience happened. That relationship ended 7 years ago.
And how did you find that? How did that relationship end? I'm just curious. Like, did you find, Wow, 3 years. I'm still kind of blown away by that.
Yeah, I was young. Neither of us were really speaking our truth. There were so many blocks to intimacy. We weren't really self-expressed. It kind of naturally dissolved, and I moved away. And actually, it was when I moved away from my hometown, that I felt like it was time to have a fresh start. And that's when I moved to Kelowna, BC, actually, and started looking at this block that I had to my sexual expression and the shame that I had for my body. And unknowingly at the time, I started seeking healing, and I found myself really drawn to dancing. I saw a burlesque show and I was like, oh my God, these women are so free in their bodies and they have no shame around sexuality. And I found myself feeling pleasure again out dancing at different DJ shows, and was like, wow, like this is where I feel so free and so alive and so comfortable to just be all of me, that I was drawn to actually become a professional go-go dancer. And yeah, it was a part of me seeking that healing of reclaiming that expression and finding a way to relate to my body and my sexuality that was safe and free and liberating and beautiful.
And how long did you do the go-go dancing for?
For 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah.
Holy crap. Now, I'm really curious because you went from this place of being really, really ashamed of your sexuality to, in a lot of ways, flaunting your sexual desirability, which isn't necessarily the same as flaunting your sexuality. It's flaunting your desirability, or it could be in a man's eyes, not necessarily in a woman's eyes. How did you perceive it, actually?
I found it to be very empowering. So for me, when I was on stage, I wasn't even necessarily thinking about what anyone else thought. I was fully present in the moment. I was listening to the music. I was moving my body in ways that felt liberating and free and good, like felt pleasurable. And it was a bonus that I got to get paid for it. You know, it was something that I would have done in my living room on my own, but it felt much more healing to claim it in the world and be like, this is my choice. And this is a part of who I am. It's not all of who I am, but it was reclaiming a part of who I was.
I like the way that you define that, because I think especially when it comes to the sexual shame, people can really identify with their sexuality and think that, oh, sexual shame, I am sexual, but I'm ashamed of it, therefore I am unworthy and I should be ashamed of myself, and then build this identity around who they are.
Yeah.
But yeah, you just said it very well, it was embracing a part of you.
It was a part of me that I felt I had lost. I felt like I had lost it when I was a teenager, when I did start going through feeling bullied and ostracized. I felt like I had rejected that part of me into the shadows. And so it started coming out in unhealthy expressions in my later year, when I was like 16 and whatnot. And then coming into my 20s and learning how to reclaim it in a way that was integrative.
Yeah, I'm curious. I still want to talk a little bit more about what it was like when you were a teenager and you started exploring in the unhealthy way. Like how did you find yourself treating yourself?
Just very self-loathing. You know, I felt, as a lot of women can probably relate to, that whether they're doing it consciously or unconsciously, that their only worth in life is their desirability or the way that they look, or getting a man to like them or love them through using their sexuality, and not really seeing my worth as more than that. And also not really seeing that my sexuality was beautiful, but it was ultimately for me and not for others. And it was my choice if I wanted to share that, instead of just giving it away freely for love.
Yeah. I mean, did you get any kind of alternative narrative during your high school years that your sexuality was fine, or was that the only narrative you were getting?
No, that was the only narrative I was getting. I didn't start getting a new narrative until probably the last 3 years, when I started consciously creating a new narrative and seeking out teachers and guides and resources to help me heal this wound within me.
I want to get into that in a bit. I wonder about now, like, how did that sexual shame? Can we go a little bit more into your pleasure? Because you said that it affected your pleasure, and how did the sexual shame affect your pleasure?
Yeah, so the way that like shame and rejection works on like a neurobiological level is when we learn like my sexuality is shameful or my body is shameful, we actually disconnect from that part of us. So my pussy was numb. And when I did have sex, sometimes there was pain because our vaginas can store a lot of energy and a lot of trauma. So when I was having sex, I felt like I said earlier, like I was being used on like a mental level, but on a physiological level, I felt nothing. Like there's no like pleasure. There just wasn't a connection from my mind to my vagina or anywhere really. It was pleasure just didn't feel safe, didn't feel possible, and it felt unenjoyable, which I think a lot of women can relate to as well. And I had no idea that the connection, I just thought I was broken. I just thought like sex isn't for me. I don't enjoy it. Why do I even need it? But really it was just shame and trauma that had locked my pleasure away, thinking that it wasn't safe to feel it.
I mean, at what point did you, that leads me into my next point, is that at what point did you know that it was sexual shame that was the problem? Because if you're thinking to yourself, oh, just sex isn't for me, a lot of people just give up. And I dated women when I was much younger, in my early 20s, and they said, yeah, I don't really enjoy sex all that much. And all I could think is, how? Well, I guess it's just not for some people. I think that's a little weird, but it's just not for some people, I guess. But, you know, obviously in retrospect, I know now what's actually going on. But at what point did you realize, holy shit, maybe I just had this really bad narrative and there's a different way of thinking about this and experiencing my sexuality? What was the catalyst for you that created that change?
Yeah, so the catalyst that created that change for me was I entered into a relationship with someone who did have a very healthy narrative on sexuality and who did have a lot of experience with healing and personal development and transformational work. And it really encouraged me to start looking at my beliefs and my narratives and my relationship to my body and myself. And so I started seeking resources. I found a book that really helped me. It was Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski. And then very synchronistically, I came across my teacher, Layla Martin, and her work, and hearing her story from sexual abuse and shutdown to now one of the leading experts on sexual healing. I really resonated with her story and was like, wow, she can go from feeling the way that she did to being the badass that she is. I was like, there's got to be a way for me too. And I started to open up to the possibility of there being another way and to be able to feel pleasure like so many other women experienced and talked about.
So so that didn't happen overnight for you?
Oh, absolutely not. It's been probably 3 years since I started my journey, and I still feel like, although I'm so much like further along my path than I was 3 years ago, by no means am I an expert. It's like something I explore every single day. And I'm humble and like on the path with everyone else, just exploring how deep this really goes into our unconscious mind, these messages that we get around our bodies and sexuality.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that the more I learn, the more I think that the more I realize how little I know, which Absolutely. Is really counterintuitive. It doesn't really make any sense. The more knowledge I gain, the more it's because the more you learn, the more resources you get, the more you realize there's so much more to learn. So that yeah, that's where that comes from. Yeah, it's crazy. I understand.
Yes.
I understand.
The more you learn, the less you know.
So I know it's so weird to say that.
Yeah.
That's crazy. I mean, so he didn't heal you. He just guided you down the path to change your own narrative, and you were willing to do that yourself.
Absolutely. I think that the choice always has to come from within.
Yeah, rather than getting someone else to heal you, you have to do the healing yourself.
Yeah.
Now, I'm also curious about when you were a go-go dancer and you were still dealing with all that sexual shame, how did you handle people's sexual advances?
It was actually really powerful for me to learn how to set boundaries and learn like to stand my ground and learn like actually I deserve respect just because I'm a performer and I'm wearing a costume compared to underwear. It doesn't mean that you get to treat me like an object. Like I am here providing a service of entertainment, and it's something that I love and it's something that makes me feel good. So I got to learn how to set boundaries and teach people how to treat me, but also do it in a way that felt respectful to them as well. You know, like I wasn't coming across as like an angry bitch being like, don't. I wasn't raging at customers of the establishment. You know, there was a fine balance of learning how to stand my ground and also assert myself.
Now, so you were fine with guys looking at you as an object in that sense, so long as they also treated you with respect?
It's so funny because it may seem like that could have been going on in my mind, but really when I was dancing, I didn't give a fuck what other people thought. You know, I barely even saw the people in the crowd. It wasn't within my, it wasn't for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
So I wasn't necessarily, was I okay with it? Is that your question? Was I okay with it?
You know, I guess there is a difference between being a go-go dancer and being a stripper, because when you're a stripper, you're literally dancing for someone else. So it's a very overt relationship that's going on between two people, or between the dancer and the patrons. In a go-go dancer scenario, I mean, as a straight guy, I know how I look at go-go dancers, and they're very nice to look at. And I definitely have sexual thoughts when I see go-go dancers. Obviously, the way I handle my sexuality now is very different than the way I did before. It's much more healthy. So that's what I mean is, if you're going to be go-go dancing, you're going to have a lot of guys looking at you. Some guys might be looking at you with various emotions: jealousy, anger, complete desire and lust, losing the sense of where they are because they're so captivated by you. And I'm curious how you were able to handle that energy that's being given towards you when you're not in a stripper role, you're in a go-go dancer role. But as straight men, when we see a woman who's beautiful and is dancing, is pretty much naked, it's going to get our attention. So,
and I think it's just as important that we don't shame men's sexual desire as much as we don't shame women's sexual desire. Right? Like, it's okay to give permission to people to have these feelings and to have these responses. It's how we act on them that is healthy or unhealthy. So if a guy was to be disrespectful and giving me that energy in a way that was not appropriate, then that's where I get to set a boundary and be like, that's not okay. But if
like
he's
the
having
finger in the tongue, like doing that thing when you're dancing, that's a no-go. That's a no-go.
But if a man is having sexual arousal or is feeling lust or desire or feeling so mesmerized by a woman's beauty, is that wrong?
No. Were you asking me? I wasn't sure if it was
kind of a rhetorical question. But really, like, if we're going to be having this conversation about sexual shame, it's not just about women. Like, men's sexuality has been suppressed and shamed just as much as women. And it might not be as conscious.
It's a different kind of shaming.
It is, but it's still shame. And I think that because both sides of the equation, actually all humans are being sexually suppressed right now. It's coming out in unhealthy expressions in so many different ways for all genders.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious, what is it that you did, some certain things that you actually did to overcome that shame in a culture that especially uses women's bodies to sell everything from like mousetraps to fucking deodorant. Like, it's just retarded. It's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you can't show a nipple because you're breastfeeding your child. I mean, show everything but. Actually, Miley Cyrus said this on an interview. I think it was with Jimmy Kimmel. And she said, you know what? America has no problems with boobs. Mm-hmm. It's nipples. Nipples. I thought it was funny. I'm not doing a very, very good justice right here. I'm not doing it justice. But I'm curious what you did because in society is throwing all this stuff at you. What are some things that you did to say, no, fuck you, that's not right. This is the truth about my sexuality and sexuality as a whole.
Yeah. Well, it's challenging going against cultural conditioning. That's really the awakening process. It's like coming back to our truth and stripping away all the layers of who we've been told we should be, how we should act, how we should dress, how we should behave. Like, it really comes down to the root of like you finding your truth for you. And for me, like, it felt good to be in my body, and it still feels good to be in my body. And can you repeat the question?
Sure. I think I know where you're going with it. Can I try to like say back to you what I think that what I hear you saying?
Yeah.
It sounds like it wasn't that you were necessarily challenging the societal narratives. You were actually just trusting more of what was going on in your body. And the more that you did that, the more you started to recognize the truth that your sexuality was fine. That's just a part of you.
Absolutely.
Was that basically what you were saying?
Yeah. And it's really hard to change anything outside of ourselves. So we can push back at society and go like, you shouldn't do that. That's the wrong way. This is all fucked up. Like, we need to change everything. But that's like, if you've ever tried to change something outside of yourself, it's almost near impossible. The only thing that we have control of changing is within, and changing how we show up, how we're being, how we're expressing ourselves. And like, the more rooted we are in like our truth, and the more rooted we are in self-love, and the more rooted we are in like our joy and our pleasure and our bliss, and the more we can accept like all aspects of ourselves, both light and dark, the more that becomes like a catalyst for other people who see that to be like, like, what are they doing differently? Like, how can I change? And gives other people permission to really just be all of themselves. Like, if you're really rooted in like in self-love and like doing it from such like a pure intention of like, I really just want to like be the best version of myself that I can, and like show up in the world that in a way that supports others to feel good about themselves too. That's how change occurs. It's not by pushing and fighting and trying to make the other, like trying to make something outside of yourself the problem. It all starts within. Everything that we're seeing outside of us is a reflection of what's going on within. That's my personal belief. That's what I found to be true. And like, you or in the audience can try that on and see if it fits for them. But that's something that I find a lot of empowerment in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's everything that I stand for, that the world is a reflection of what's going on within us.
Absolutely.
Now, you had also written a blog where a guy had said to you, it's something along the lines of, yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
I know the one you're talking about. Yeah.
He basically said, oh God, I wrote it down. Why do you dress sexually if you don't want sexual attention? That's kind of the gist of it, right?
Why do you tell people to love themselves while sexualizing yourself?
Yeah,
I think
there you
that
go.
was more along the lines. Or why do you tell people to accept themselves while sexualizing themselves? Yeah. that actually sparked a lot in me, because it was like, I sexualize myself because I'm a sexual being, and that is accepting myself. I'm not just a sexual being. There's so many aspects of my humanity, of my spirituality. There's so many different layers to who I am and to all of us, like who all of us are. And if someone else is like triggered by someone expressing like their authentic truth, then it's an opportunity for them to look in. Like a judgment is always an opportunity to look in. Like if I'm judging something outside of myself, where am I judging that same aspect within my being? Yeah.
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 Okay. I'm not gonna lie. I was writing another question down because you said something and it triggered something, and I heard the first half of that, and I'm sorry. I could have just ignored. I could have just acted as though I heard everything, but
Perfect.
you would, as you were saying that, I don't remember the specific thing that you just said that triggered this, but have you been able to receive men's sexual desire after learning to heal your own sexual desire? So how have you noticed your relationship to men's sexuality change as you've developed your own sexuality?
As I've learned to celebrate my own sexuality, I've learned to celebrate men's sexuality.
Now, was that a byproduct, or did you have to like overtly look at men's sexuality, or was it a byproduct of looking at your own?
It was a byproduct of looking at my own. When I had to start sifting through all of the layers of shame and trauma and cultural conditioning that was piled on top of my own like original essence, which included my innocent sexuality. And I went through that experience of how difficult it was for me to come home to that place within myself, and the journey that I had to go on to find that. I really had compassion for men and compassion for their journey and where they're at, and like the shame and trauma and cultural conditioning that gets piled on top of their experience of being a man and having desire and having lust and being told that they shouldn't feel that way.
That it's predatory.
Yeah. And how that's equally as damaging for our society and our culture as it is to slut shame a woman.
That's interesting.
I feel like this is an idea I'm exploring and I'm curious about is, there's light and shadows to everything, to all expression, healthy and unhealthy, and the sexual shadow of the feminine is objectification and is manipulation using their bodies and is, yeah. And,
being manipulative, using your sexuality and using your desire to get a desired outcome of your own. It's through manipulation, coercion, through your sexuality. That's the shadow side of your sexuality.
And that's not to say that's bad or wrong. We all have the potential within us to express it in that way. And it's actually owning that potential that makes it not come out in unhealthy ways, and owning that that's a part of us and that we are able to have that expression and love that and reclaim that actually allows us to express in healthy ways. So there's the feminine shadow and there's the masculine shadow of the predatorial sexuality and rape and abuse and all the ways that like a man's sexuality comes out in unhealthy ways when he's told to suppress it. And so there's both sides of the equation. And the more that a man can look within him and recognize that like he has that potential to express his shadow, that that's a part of him, that he may or may not have behaved in that ways, and really forgive himself and embrace that part of him with love and compassion, the less likely it is to come out in unhealthy ways, the less likely it is to control him. And so there's this reclaiming the shadow work that needs to be done by both sides of the equation in order to come back to our healthy expression.
That is so amazing. And that's actually related to that question where I thought that I had lost track of what you were saying, but that's actually how you ended it, was being able to recognize that aspect in myself and do that inner work on this, that's how I can relate well to that person there. And that's what you're just saying in that same sense of how do I heal that dark aspect of men's sexuality is healing your own dark aspect of a woman's sexuality, of the feminine sexuality. And that's because I had asked myself that, well, what is the darker side? What is the shadow side to women's sexuality? And I didn't know, because I'm not a woman. I know what the dark side is to men's sexuality because I know that shadow side of myself. And obviously I'm not going to know unless a woman has done that work and can share, hey, that's the shadow side. And both can, well, and the feminine, I mean, generally speaking, women can't necessarily physically outpower men, generally speaking. But you can definitely outsmart us and be coercive and use our desire against us. And that can be quite damaging. That can be extremely damaging. And in a lot of ways, although it's not as overt, and I don't want to say, I don't believe in comparative suffering. I think that's I think it's ridiculous. That's amazing. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome, Ryan.
That's amazing. Yeah. How do you heal? Yeah. I mean, there's a video that I'm planning on putting together with regards to just oriented around compassion, and how you can do that is finding the humanity in someone else. I mean, if you start to dehumanize someone by saying, I could never do that. I could never, say, rape someone. I could never punch someone. I could never do those things. That's because that person is inhuman. That person is evil. They're an animal. They need to be destroyed. And in the Stanford prison experiment, they showed that when you start to dehumanize other people, it creates this separation between you and them, which makes it easier for you to do horrible things to them. But when you start to recognize the humanity in other people, it becomes increasingly difficult to do nasty things to them, because you recognize those aspects in them are also in you as well. And the more you can do that, you see that humanity and you see the connection between the two of you. And the more you start to do that, the closer you become. And you don't want to destroy them, because if you do that, you're actually destroying yourself.
Absolutely.
And so understanding that's very helpful to know about and learn about the shadow side of women's sexuality. What made you discover that?
Shadow work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where me and you both met. The shadow work is challenging, and not a lot of people want to go there, but it's so key if we're actually if we want to resolve some of the larger scale issues that we're seeing right now.
Yeah.
We have to be able to see that, like, it's not just outside of us that's the problem. Like, we all, even if these shadow aspects of ourselves aren't manifesting in behaviors, we still have to be able to admit that we have the potential to do that behavior. Like, I may not be, let's see, for example, what can I use as an example? I was just doing a shadow work process yesterday, actually. Okay, so let's say this is a pretty light one, but we're working with an archetype within us. So I have the potential to be a queen, and just embody a queen energy and express myself in a queen energy. But in order,
so do I.
So, you do, actually.
I can so be a queen.
We actually.
I think the definition of queen is totally different.
So the king, okay, or queen.
Okay.
You could be a queen too. Seriously.
Okay.
But the shadow aspect of that is just the opposite. So maybe that's a servant. And I have that within me to be a servant as well. And what are the gifts that each archetype teach me? A servant could teach me humility. It could teach me service. It could teach me empathy, and being a queen can teach me about leadership. It can teach me about confidence, teach me about all these things. So when we're looking at some of these darker shadow aspects, it's like, okay, so what does the dark archetype of the dark feminine sexuality, what does that teach me? It taught me how to learn to like respect my body. It taught me what it feels like to be out of alignment. It taught me what are like looking for the gifts in the shadow, you know, like, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because as long as we fear the shadow and fear going there and fear admitting that it's part of us, the more control it has over us.
Yeah, you start to act out unconsciously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's basically you start to act out unconsciously. You start to take actions, think that you know what the motivations are, but ultimately you're being driven by something completely different. Mm-hmm. That's why there's that Buddhist precept of challenge your perceptions. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, I'm also curious here as well about, do you think women would want to have more sex if they had less shame around their sexuality?
Absolutely.
Okay, then let's work on this sexual shame.
Let's stop shaming each other.
Let's stop shaming each other.
You know?
Less shaming, more banging.
Yeah.
Such a silly, ridiculous question, but I wanted to ask it. This is something that I was curious. I keep on using that word curious. God, that's the thing about having a podcast or like doing interviews like this. You start hearing all these little things that you do over time. It's like, I gotta stop saying that word. I gotta stop saying I gotta stop saying this phrase. I gotta change it and ask a question this way. So self-critical sometimes. Oh my God. Okay. Do you think that a woman's decision to be selective with her partners is due to the vulnerability that comes with sex? Because I mean, you're literally letting someone inside of you. Or do you think that it's due to the sexual shame, that they're so ashamed of their sexuality that, you know what, I can only let a finite, like only specific people?
I think
that's a very general question.
Yeah, it's a very general question. So like, it's really difficult to answer.
Okay. We can leave it then.
Yeah, it would have to be a unique.
Yeah.
Individual.
That's kind of what I figured as I was saying it. Like when I wrote it down, I was like, I wonder about this. But then as I was saying it out loud, I'm like, actually, you know what? This is a very generalized question, but it's too far gone. I've gone too far. I have to finish. I have to finish saying this. Cool. Well, I do have, I guess going back to where you were before and how you view your sexuality now, how can women know if their view of sexuality is one coming from sexual shame or one that's coming from a healthy perspective? So I guess what's the difference between an unhealthy slut and a sexually empowered woman? Because you've been both.
A sexually empowered woman could still be a slut if that's what she wants, because that's her choice.
Yes. Sexually liberated, untamed temptress?
Sounds about right. I've heard that one before.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. Okay, so I'm referring to your sexuality, where you were before, how you felt about your sexuality in comparison to where you are now and how you feel it. And what can be the signals to women to, hey, maybe I should do some work on this?
Some signals to women. Can you repeat the question? I'm not sure if it's landing fully.
Sure. Okay, sure. How did you, what's the difference? Can you go back to where you were when you were in high school and you started expressing your sexuality? Yeah, you know what? Now I'm trying to restructure that question. basically we've talked about it for the entire episode, but I wanted to bring it together in a succinct sort of answer. You were a slut in high school, but you were quite unhealthy with your sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you want to be a slut, you can be, but you're quite empowered with your sexuality. What is the difference between those two, and how would a woman know that she's unhealthy with it?
I would say that the difference between the two are self-love. Is one coming from a self-love place and an inner choice of like, I'm doing this because it feels good, or am I doing this because I think I should, or I don't think I'm worthy, or I think that I'll be loved if I do this. It really comes down to feeling like I love and accept myself, and I'm going to listen to my body, and my body gives me clues. Like I can feel really contracted, or I can feel really open if it's a yes or a no. So really, like, it comes down to like the inner relationship that we have to self, and like that being the driving factor, motivation for our choices.
Okay, so it's the motivation behind the actions, not the actions themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's this one quote that I love. You know, nudity empowers some and modesty empowers some. You know, empowerment is all about like tuning in and feeling into what is true for us and what makes us feel empowered.
What if I feel empowered through public masturbation?
I would question if that's true empowerment, or
Okay.
if that's coming from
That's
some.
actually true. That's actually very, very true. It's feeling like there's a book. It's an amazing book. It's oh God, I can see the cover of it. It'll come to me in a second. The Four Cornerstones of Eroticism. Boom! I knew it was going to come. The author talks about people like that, and he said it's actually about having power over people and seeing their reactions, and that's where they feel this power. So it's actually not sexual empowerment. You're right. Very, very good observation. Plus, it was just being a goof, anyways. But yeah. So
Yeah,
how do
good
you?
point, because people would ask that.
Yeah, totally. Now, what is it that you do with your clients? How do you help women start to do that exploration and heal their sexuality and heal from that sexual shame?
Yeah, so the type of coaching that I do is actually very somatic based, and we work on the three parts of the brain. There's like the cortex, which creates our stories and has a lot to do with our cultural conditioning and the layers of meaning that we've piled on top of our bodies and our sexuality and our pleasure. And then we go deeper into the limbic system, and the limbic system is where we store all of our emotional responses like shame, pleasure, joy, bliss, fear. And then we go deeper into the primal brain, which is sometimes called the reptilian brain. And down there is our primal impulse for sexuality, which is we were born with, which is doesn't have the story wrapped around it, that is a part of our original essence. And the primal brain is also connected to our body and our sensations. And there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score that talks about how trauma is actually stored in the body. So we actually have to get through the layers of like story, get down through our emotions and down into our primal brain to see like what's going on in our body around our sexuality, and what wires together fires together. So if we learned at a young age through like trauma or shame that our sexuality is wrong, gross, or disgusting, our limbic system will wire that emotion into our body, into our sexuality. And then the cortex comes on top of that and creates the belief around it. So in our coaching sessions, I guide them through guided meditation, through breath work, through specific questions that I ask to get to the body and to see what is it that they've wired together. How can they feel that? Because we actually have to feel whatever we've wired together with our sexuality. So we have to feel the fear, feel the shame, feel the pain body that's been stored there, and bring self-love and compassion to integrate that, and then create like a new story around it, create a new narrative. And there's lots of different ways that, lots of different tools that we use in our sessions. And yeah.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. It's really hard to heal from something if you can't identify it. If all you do is just have this ache in your body, or this constant sense of anxiety or depression or uncertainty or insecurity, it helps to be able to identify where that's actually coming from. Basically, being able to identify what's ever there in the shadows. At that point, it's like, oh, that's that talking. I can shut that one up and insert something different that counteracts that narrative.
Exactly. And so it's not just about like feeling the pain or feeling whatever we've stored in our body and in our minds. Just like you said, it's about replacing it with something new, replacing it with a narrative, creating, we actually can create feelings in our body. Like if you visualize something that makes you happy, you'll most likely feel the emotion of being happy, because our minds don't actually know the difference between visualization and reality. So by doing the somatic work and doing the visualization in the sessions, we actually are rewiring the mind at a deeper level. And then I give my clients practices to take home with them that will continue to help them repetitively choose that new neuronal pathway over and over again. And over time, the old pattern will slowly dissolve. And this is a lot to do with Dr. Joe Dispenza's work too, is heavily influenced some of the trainings that I've taken.
You've done a lot of work the last few years.
I'm a student for life.
Definitely, you and me both. That was, yeah. I mean, would you say that you're completely free of your sexual shame, or do you still have to make little adjustments and course corrections along the way?
I still have to make adjustments. Like even before this call today, I would notice in my body tightness in my chest, anxiety, and tuning into what was going on. It was like, I'm afraid of being seen. I'm afraid of being rejected. I'm afraid of being ostracized. I'm afraid of talking about this taboo topic. And tuning into that part of me and learning how to take care of it, to hold it myself. And it's an ongoing process. It's really challenging to go against the grain, go against what the collective programming tells us to believe about our bodies and sexuality. It's really challenging, but it's something that's well worth the effort. For the freedom that I feel in my relationships and the freedom that I feel in sex, the amount of pleasure that I'm able to experience from going to completely shut down and being numb in most of my body, especially my vagina, to now feeling like I can orgasm through breath alone and have like extremely ecstatic experiences of like dissolving into like the cosmos. Yeah. Just 3 years.
I want that.
Thing is, like, I'm not saying that to brag about having this ability, because we all have that ability. It's just a matter of peeling back the layers that's blocking it. And I work on it every day. It's something that I'm extremely passionate about.
I'm so passionate about my orgasms.
I mean, we should all be passionate about orgasms. It's proven they're really good for our bodies and nervous system. Pleasure just is so delightful.
I concur. So, how can people reach you? Actually, before I do that, like, what is there anything that we haven't really touched on at this point that that you think needs to be said? Maybe any open loops that I've left.
Yeah, I just want to speak to like the people that may feel triggered by conversations around sexuality, and just for it to be an invitation and not feel pressured to have to change, but just an invitation to what could be possible for them if they could find the courage to really look at this part of themselves. And it's not easy. I get it. There's a lot of liberation available on the other side of that, and that they are strong and brave enough to look at these parts of them that may feel resistance or fear or triggered by conversations like this. Just like an invitation to look at that and to feel into it. Get curious. Use your word there, curiosity. Why do you feel that way? An invitation to listeners. Why? Why do I feel this way? What could be going on? What messages have I heard about what have I experienced about my sexuality? You know, just an invitation for the listener.
Awesome. Thank you so much. How can people reach you, Amy?
Can go to my website, www.amymeraki.com, or just email me, hello@amymeraki.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm still kind of blown away by the shadow side there. I fucking love it. I love that kind of balance. I love it. Thank you so much. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.